The reality problem. How you were born as a naive realist. Minimal consciousness is the appearance of a world. However, if we solve the one-world problem and the now problem, all we have is a model of a unified world and a model of the present moment in the brain. We have a representation of a single world and a representation of a single moment. Clearly, the appearance of a world is something different. Imagine you could suddenly apprehend the whole world, your own body, the book in your hands, and all of your current surroundings as a mental model. Would this still be conscious experience? Now, try to imagine something even more difficult. The robust sense of presence you are enjoying right now is itself only a special kind of image. It is a time representation in your brain, a fiction, not the real thing. What would happen if you could distance yourself from the current moment? If the nowness of this current moment turned out not to be the real now, but only an elegant portrait of presence in your mind, would you still be conscious? This is not simply an empirical issue. It also possesses a distinct philosophical flavor. The pivotal question is how to get from a world model and a now model to exactly what you have as you are reading this, the presence of a world. The answer lies in the transparency of phenomenal representations. Recall that a representation is transparent if the system using it cannot recognize it as a representation. A world model active in the brain is transparent if the brain has no chance of discovering that it is a model. A model of the current moment is transparent if the brain has no chance of discovering that it is simply the result of information processing currently going on in itself. Imagine you are watching a movie on TV, 2001. A Space Odyssey, say, and you have just watched the scene in which the victorious ape-man throws his bone weapon high into the air, at which point the film jumps into the future, matching the image of the tumbling bone to that of a spacecraft. Dr. Haywood R. Floyd reaches moon base Clavius in his lunar landing craft and discusses with the local Soviet scientists the potential for culture shock and social disorientation presented by the discovery of a monolith on the moon. When they arrive at the gigantic black monolith, a member of the exploring party reaches out and strokes its smooth surface, mirroring the awe and curiosity the ape-men exhibited millions of years earlier. The scientists and astronauts gather around it for a group photo, but suddenly an ear-splitting high-pitched tone is picked up by their earphones, a tone emitted by the monolith as the sun shines down on it. You are completely engaged in the scene unfolding in front of you, to the point of identifying with the bewildered space-suited humans. However, you can distance yourself from the movie at any time and become aware that there is a separate you are sitting on the couch in the living room and only watching all this. You can also move up close to the screen and inspect the little pixels, thousands of little squares of light rapidly blinking on and off, creating a continuous flowing image as soon as you are a couple of yards away. Not only is this flowing image made up of individual pixels, but the temporal dynamic is not really continuous at all. The individual pixels blink on and off according to a certain rhythm, changing their color in abrupt steps. You cannot do this distancing with your consciousness. It is a different kind of medium. If you look at the book in your hands and try to apprehend individual pixels, you can't see any. The appearance of the book is dense and impenetrable. Visual attention cannot dissolve the fluidity, the continuity of your book experience as it can discover the individual pixels when you take a closer look at the TV screen. The blinding speed with which your brain activates the visual model of the book and integrates it with the tactile sensations in your fingers is simply too fast.
One might argue that this disparity exists because the system creating the pixels is also the one trying to detect them. Of course, in the continuous flow of information processing in the brain, nothing like pixels really exists. Still, could your inability to break the book percept down into pixels be caused by something other than the speed of integration in the brain? If your brain worked much more slowly, say, if it could detect time spans of a year but no briefer, you still wouldn't be able to detect those pixels. You would still perceive a seamless passage of time, because the conscious working of our brain is not a single uniform event but a multi-layered chain of events in which different processes are densely coupled and interacting all the time. The brain creates what are called higher-order representations. If you attend to your perception of a visual object, such as this book, then there is at least one second-order process, i.e., attentional processing, taking a first-order process, in this case, visual perception, as its object. If the first-order process, the process creating the seen object, the book in your hands, integrates its information in a smaller time window than the second-order process, namely, the attention you're directing at this new inner model, then the integration process on the first-order level will itself become transparent, in the sense that you cannot consciously experience it. By necessity, you are now blind to the fundamental construction process. Transparency is not so much a question of the speed of information processing as of the speed of different types of processing, such as attention and visual perception, relative to each other. Just as swiftly and effortlessly, the book model is bound with other models, such as the models of your hands and of the desk, and seamlessly integrated into your overall conscious space of experience. Because it has been optimized over millions of years, this mechanism is so fast and so reliable that you never notice its existence. It makes your brain invisible to itself. You are in contact only with its content, you never see the representation as such, therefore, you have the illusion of being directly in contact with the world. And that is how you become a naive realist, a person who thinks she is in touch with an observer-independent reality. If you talk to neuroscientists as a philosopher, you will be introduced to new concepts and find some of them extremely useful. One I found particularly helpful was the notion of metabolic price. If a biological brain wants to develop a new cognitive capacity, it must pay a price. The currency in which the price is paid is sugar. Additional energy must be made available and more glucose must be burned to develop and stabilize this new capacity. As in nature in general, there is no such thing as a free lunch. If an animal is to evolve, say, color vision, this new trait must pay by making new sources of food and sugar available to it. If a biological organism wants to develop a conscious self or think in concepts or master a language, then this step into a new level of mental complexity must be sustainable. It requires additional neural hardware, and that hardware requires fuel. That fuel is sugar, and the new trait must enable our animal to find this extra amount of energy in its environment. Likewise, any good theory of consciousness must reveal how it paid for itself. In principle, consciousness could be a byproduct of other traits that paid for themselves, but the fact that it has remained stable over time suggests that it was adaptive. A convincing theory must explain how having a world appear to you enabled you to extract more energy from your environment than a zombie could. This evolutionary perspective also helps solve the puzzle of naive realism.
Our ancestors did not need to know that a bear representation was currently active in their brains or that they were currently attending to an internal state representing a slowly approaching wolf. Thus neither image required them to burn precious sugar. All they needed to know was, bear over there, or wolf approaching from the left. Knowing that all of this was just a model off the world and of the now was not necessary for survival. This additional kind of knowledge would have required the formation of what philosophers call meta-representations or images about other images, thoughts about thoughts. It would have required additional hardware in the brain and more fuel. Evolution sometimes produces superfluous new traits by chance, but these luxurious properties are rarely sustained over long periods of time. Thus, the answer to the question of why our conscious representations of the world are transparent, why we are constitutionally unable to recognize them as representations, and why this proved a viable, stable, strategy for survival and procreation probably is that the formation of meta-representations would not have been cost-efficient. It would have been too expensive in terms of the additional sugar we would have had to find in our environment. A smaller time scale gives another way of understanding why we were all born as naive realists. Why are we unaware of the tunnel-like nature of consciousness? As noted, the robust illusion of being directly in touch with the outside world has to do with the speed of neural information processing in our brains. Further, subjective experience is not generated by one process alone but by various interacting functions, multisensory integration, short-term memory, attention, and so on. My theory says that, in essence, consciousness is the space of attentional agency. Conscious information is exactly that set of information currently active in our brains to which we can deliberately direct our high-level attention. Low-level attention is automatic and can be triggered by entirely unconscious events. For a perception to be conscious does not mean you deliberately access it with the help of your attentional mechanisms. On the contrary, most things we're aware of are on the fringe of our consciousness and not in its focus. But whatever is available for deliberately directed attention is what is consciously experienced. Nevertheless, if we carefully direct our visual attention at an object, we are constitutionally unable to apprehend the earlier processing stages. Taking a closer look doesn't help. We are unable to attend to the construction process that generates the model of the book in our brains. As a matter of fact, attention often seems to do exactly the opposite. By stabilizing the sensory object, we make it even more real. That is why the walls of the tunnel are impenetrable for us. Even if we believe that something is just an internal construct, we can experience it only as given and never as constructed. This fact may well be cognitively available to us, because we may have a correct theory or concept of it, but it is not attentionally or introspectively available, simply because on the level of subjective experience, we have no point of reference outside the tunnel. Whatever appears to us, however it is mediated, appears as reality.
Please try for a moment to inspect closely the holistic experience of seeing and simultaneously touching the book in your hands and of feeling its weight. Try hard to become aware of the construction process in your brain. You will find two things. First, you cannot do it. Second, the surface of the tunnel is not two-dimensional. It possesses considerable depth and is composed of very different sensory qualities: touch, sound, even smell. In short, the tunnel has a high-dimensional, multimodal surface. All this contributes to the fact that you cannot recognize the walls of the tunnel as an inner surface. This simply does not resemble any tunnel experience you've ever had. Why are the walls of the neurophenomenological cave so impenetrable? An answer is that in order to be useful, like the desktop on the graphical user interface of your personal computer, the inside surface of the cave must be closed and fully realistic. It acts as a dynamic filter. Imagine you could introspectively become aware of ever deeper and earlier phases of your information processing while looking at the book in your hands. What would happen? The representation would no longer be transparent, but it would still remain inside the tunnel. A flood of interacting patterns would suddenly rush at you. Alternative interpretations and intensely competing associations would invade your reality. You would lose yourself in the myriad of micro-events taking place in your brain at every millisecond. You would get lost inside yourself. Your mind would explode into endless loops of self-exploration. Maybe this is what Aldous Huxley meant when, in his 1954 classic, The Doors of Perception, he quoted William Blake: "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up, till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern." The dynamic filter of phenomenal transparency is one of nature's most intriguing inventions, and it has had far-reaching consequences. Our inner images of the world around us are quite reliable. In order to be good representations, our conscious models of bears, of wolves, of books in our hands, of smiles on our friends' faces, must serve as a window on the world. This window must be clean and crystal clear. That is what phenomenal transparency is. It contributes to the effortlessness and seamlessness that are the hallmark of reliable conscious perceptions that portray the world around us in a sufficiently accurate manner. We don't have to know or care about how this series of little miracles keeps unfolding in our brains. We can simply enjoy conscious experience as an invisible interface to reality. As long as nothing goes wrong, naive realism makes for a very relaxed way of living. However, questions arise. Are there people who aren't naive realists, or special situations in which naive realism disappears? My theory, the self-model theory of subjectivity, predicts that as soon as a conscious representation becomes opaque, that is, as soon as we experience it as a representation, we lose naive realism. Consciousness without naive realism does exist. This happens whenever, with the help of other, second-order representations, we become aware of the construction process, of all the ambiguities and dynamical stages preceding the stable state that emerges at the end. When the window is dirty or cracked, we immediately realize that conscious perception is only an interface, and we become aware of the medium itself. We doubt that our sensory organs are working properly. We doubt the existence of whatever it is we are seeing or feeling, and we realize that the medium itself is fallible. In short, if the book in your hands lost its transparency, you would experience it as a state of your mind rather than as an element of the outside world. You would immediately doubt its independent existence. It would be more like a book thought than a book perception.
Precisely this happens in various situations, for example, in visual hallucinations during which the patient is aware of hallucinating, or in ordinary optical illusions when we suddenly become aware that we are not in immediate contact with reality. Normally, such experiences make us think something is wrong with our eyes. If you could consciously experience earlier processing stages of the representation of the book in your hands, the image would probably become unstable and ambiguous. It would start to breathe and move slightly. Its surface would become iridescent, shining in different colors at the same time. Immediately you would ask yourself whether this could be a dream, whether there was something wrong with your eyes, whether someone had mixed a potent hallucinogen into your drink. A segment of the wall of the ego tunnel would have lost its transparency, and the self-constructed nature of the overall flow of experience would dawn on you. In a non-conceptual and entirely non-theoretical way, you would suddenly gain a deeper understanding of the fact that this world, at this very moment, only apersto you. What if you were born with an awareness of your internal processing? Obviously, you would still not be in contact with reality as such, because you would still only know it under a representation. But you would also continuously represent yourself as representing. As in a dream in which you have become aware that you're dreaming, your world would no longer be experienced as a reality but as a form of mental content. It would all be one big thought in your mind, the mind of an ideal observer. We have arrived at a minimalist concept of consciousness. We have an answer to the question of how the brain moves from an internal world model and an internal now model to the full-blown appearance of a world. The answer is this: if the system in which these models are constructed is constitutionally unable to recognize both the world model and the current psychological moment, the experience of the present as a model as only an internal construction, then the system will of necessity generate a reality tunnel. It will have the experience of being in immediate contact with a single, unified world in a single now. For any such system, a world appears. This is equivalent to the minimal notion of consciousness we took as our starting point. If we can solve the one-world problem, the now problem, and the reality problem, we can also find the global neural correlate of consciousness in the human brain. Recall that there is a specific NCC for forms of conscious content, one for the redness of the rose, another for the rose as a whole, and so on, as well as a global NCC, which is a much larger set of neural properties underlying consciousness as a whole, or all currently active forms of conscious content, underpinning your experiential model of the world in its totality at a given moment. Solving the one-world problem, the now problem, and the reality problem involves 3 steps. First, finding a suitable phenomenological description of what it's like to have all these experiences. Second, analyzing their contents in more detail, the representational level. And third, describing the functions bringing about these contents. Discovering the global NCC means discovering how these functions are implemented in the nervous system. This would also allow us to decide which other beings on this planet enjoy the appearance of a world. These beings will have a recognizable physical counterpart in their brains. On the most simple and fundamental level, the global NCC will be a dynamic brain state exhibiting large-scale coherence. It will be fully integrated with whatever generates the virtual window of presence, because in a sense it is this window. Finally, it will have to make earlier processing stages unavailable to high-level attention. I predict that by 2050 we will have found the GNCC, the global neural correlate of consciousness. But I also predict that in the process we will discover a series of technical problems that may not be so easy to solve.